Hello and welcome back to the Metropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just last week, a new data pack has come out, and that is the Daedalus complex, which is the first pack of the Red Sand cycle, which is the new cycle that is focusing on the Renison Corpse and the location of Mars, which has in the future been colonized. This is also the last cycle that's been developed by Damon Stone, who is no longer the lead designer on Android Netrunner. And so it's kind of exciting to see what Damon has done and what he signed off on, considering he also designed the last cycle, and there's some pretty strong cards in that pack. I just want to say, sorry, before we jump into this, for those that don't know, in the description of this video, you can find timestamps to each individual card discussed on this video being the runner side. So if you're looking for something specific, I know these videos do kind of err on the long side, because I do like putting more, doing more in-depth analysis of certain cards. If you're just looking for something specific, don't feel bad about it. Just kind of go through those timestamps. That's what they're there for. Otherwise, let's jump right in. We have 8 cards here on the runner side in Daedalus Complex, and we're starting off here with Pushing the Envelope. So Pushing the Envelope is an Anarch run event. It costs 3 credits, which is kind of a lot, and it says make a run. If you have 2 or fewer cards in your grip, each installed icebreaker has +2 strength until the end of this run. It's also 2 influence, so it's technically splashable, and has flavor text by Alice Merchant, who is an upcoming runner ID in this cycle. So this card it's interesting. It can be seen either as an economy card, or it can be seen as a way to get into servers that you don't actually have normally ways to get into. Let's talk about the first case, in which is an economy card. So this gives every single icebreaker installed +2 strength. Now, if you're playing pumpable icebreakers, which isn't the thing that Anarchs are entirely known for, but if you are playing that generally saves about 2 credits per icebreaker, considering the standard on most icebreakers has been 1 credit to boost 1 strength. So across the board, 2 credits on each icebreaker per ice. So say you're in a situation where you're running on to R&D. R&D has 3 ice on it, and every single piece of ice is above the printed strength on your icebreaker. This card can save 6 credits. Now, that situation that I painted out with the 3 ice all above the strength, you're playing all fixed strength, not fixed strength breakers, this saves you 3 credits, and that's not very impressive. That's easy mark, right? It's an easy mark while running at the same time. So maybe a bit better than easy mark, but also that's a hell of a setup. Normally, if you're running through 1 or 2 pieces of ice, this is going to save you 2 to 4 credits, and you're paying 3 credits for this, and for that reason alone, I don't think that's a compelling reason to run this card. The other option is if you're playing this, is that you have fixed strength breakers, which is kind of a thing that Anarchs generally do. So things like Yogg.0 are really good breakers. However, things like Yogg or Mimic or Nefer, you can't pump the strength on without other support, and this card, Pushing the Envelope, is other support. So if you hit a 5 strength code gate and you can't break it, you might actually need Pushing the Envelope to break it. Another option is Nefer, which can help you get its strength up so you can break stuff, and then Nefer is a good breaker. Now, normally if you're running this sort of thing, you'd be running things like Data Sucker, you'd be running Cipher, and it's generally not that difficult to be able to break through ice with fixed strength breakers, regardless of this like really niche support card. So for that reason, I don't think it's that exciting. Let alone there's a condition on this card that's kind of nuts. It says you can only play this if you have 2 or fewer cards in your grip, or its ability only works if there's 2 or fewer cards in your grip while you're making that run. So this could be the 3rd card. Now, that's a pretty strict restriction. Specifically, the problem with cards in your hand is that there's no ability in Netrunner to discard cards in your hand at will. You have to play those cards and or not draw into cards. So if you have 5 cards at the beginning of your turn and you want to play this, you either have to plan for the future, which involves not drawing, and drawing is kind of the best thing you can do in Netrunner, considering you generally put good cards in your deck, but otherwise you have to trash cards in your hand and or install and play them, and that can be super difficult, especially with most decks running redundancy, unique cards, things like that. Like, if I want to play this card to save money, and I have to like first play a liberated account to go down to 0 just to get no cards in my hand or less cards in my hand, like that seems absurd. Now, there is a really, really strong Anarch card you probably know of. It's called Faust. And Faust is the easiest way within Anarch to get cards out of your hand. You can just toss them with Faust. You can toss them even without running. You can always pump the strength of a breaker at any point in time in Netrunner. That is a paid ability window. And for that reason, you could just chuck this thing until you can play it, or chuck other things from your hand until you can play this one. And that logic doesn't seem that sound to me, considering you could just use pushing the envelope with Faust and get Faust up to 4 strength for a single piece of ice. And maybe you have to throw out another card, but if you're throwing out cards just to get +2 strength with pushing the envelope, like, why don't you just throw out those cards with Faust? And that doesn't make that much sense. I could see this ability being built around this archetype, which hasn't shown up yet in Netrunner, really. I haven't seen it like pick up, which is this emptied mind archetype where you're running with few cards in your hand. There are a lot of downsides to that, obviously, not only not having access to like things to do, but you also have to worry about damage. But this could work with that. I'm still not convinced that's good, considering it is super expensive. And compare that to Injection Attack, which is a card that recently came out in the previous cycle that hasn't seen a lot of play. This is a third of the price at 1 credit. It only targets a single icebreaker, which kind of encourages you again to play this on something like Faust or AI, or even the one icebreaker that you have that you can't boost, like Yogg or Mimic. And this gives it +2 strength for the end of the run, and it's so much cheaper and so easy to play. You just pay 1 credit and it's being played, as opposed to trying to build your entire deck or throwing out cards or installing cards with pushing the envelope, which costs again 3 credits. I don't get this. Not only is, like, if this card didn't have the restriction on it and it just said make a run, each installed icebreaker has +2 strength, and it costs 3 credits, I'm not convinced it would see play either. I think just Data Sucker, Cipher exists, obviously, and it's not hard. Like, it's not hard to get through ice, and at 3 credits it's really hard to see this as an economy card because it is pretty expensive. I don't entirely get it. The art is super solid. I like the art. It's like, it's pretty abstract, but it's good, I guess. We'll see. There's a chance that there's cards coming out of the cycle that really work with this. Maybe there's more programs that can't be boosted to strength but are very strong programs. They have to be icebreakers, actually, in particular, and maybe we'll see that. But with Data Sucker being so easy, you could even play like Scrubbed. It's not hard to do that. Another thing is Safety First, which I guess this works with Safety First because at the beginning of a game, Safety First reduces your hand size, which basically discards cards from your hand, so it's kind of easy to play pushing the envelope. But this is 3 influence and is generally, I don't know, maybe they do work together pretty well, but I just don't think that's very compelling. Next up, we have a console for Anarch, and it's called Maw. It's 6 credits to install, which is pretty sizable, and it's unique like most consoles are. And at 6 credits, this gives you 2 MU, which is not too bad. And it also gives you this pretty strong ability. It says, the first time each turn you access a card not in archives and neither steal nor trash it, the corp must trash 1 card from HQ at random. And it's limited to 1 console per player, and it's 3 influence, which means you could splash this in theory, but you'd have to be pretty sure about what you're doing. This ability is really strong. Trashing cards from HQ, if this ability fires, that's an absurd amount of value. Like, getting a card out of HQ at random is the same as installing an imp, running HQ, getting through all the ice of HQ, accessing a card and throwing it out. And that's a lot of clicks, a lot of credits, and super valuable. And if you're able to fire this every turn, you're going to put a lot of, you're going to really squeeze the corp down in their limited options and how they play. A lot of decks are running on combos nowadays. I still think like exchange of information might not be as popular as it used to be with Aaron Moran, but like NBN runs a lot of combo cards to punish or tagging or to give out tags. That's really good. This could be really strong against Cerebral Imaging. That's holding a lot of cards in hand, some of them agendas, some of them like important combo pieces. That's also very good. HB was holding Biotics in hand, holding Ice sometimes in hand. Like, there's almost no faction in which this is not a strong ability. Also against Acid Spam in particular, that is usually an archetype that keeps all their agendas in HQ as much as possible before they can filter them, and that's very, very strong. Now, there is some, this card is expensive, is what I'm trying to say. It's 6 credits, which makes it, I think, the 4th most expensive console in the game, and probably it would be, if it gets played, the 2nd most expensive played console in the game. The more expensive consoles than this, you have like Monolith, which doesn't see play, Toolbox, I think, Blackguard. But the only console above this that sees play and cost is for 8 credits, you get a Security Nexus, which has a really good ability, but it's also a very sizable tempo hit. Now, how often are you seeing a card in Netrunner when you're running and you neither steal nor trash it? That means generally you have to be running either central servers, because when you run a central server, that's the only time you can access an operation or access an ice and not steal or trash it. So if you're running centrals, this is good. The other option is if you're running remotes and choosing not to trash things. And that's where I think this card gets interesting, but is in a bit of a strange situation. Asset spam is a thing in Netrunner currently. There's a lot of very competitive decks that are running like a critical mass of assets and trying to put out as many a turn, and so the runner can't keep up with them, and these assets will help the corp in their whatever their win condition is. Now, if you do have the time and money, you can pay 6 credits for this and start running unprotected assets. And the majority of assets in these asset spam decks are not protected because these decks are not running a lot of ice. And if you hit the asset, find out what it is when you access it, and choose not to trash it, this ability fires, and it's a really, really strong ability. Then you can spend your next click to come back, run, and trash that asset if you've decided that it's something that needs to go. Now, obviously, spending 6 credits for a console is sizable, and in a matchup where money is probably the most important factor, considering you're going to have to trash a lot of assets, that might be asking for a lot. Secondly, while it's a very good click to spend a click trashing a random card from HQ, you're also taxing yourself on clicks, because if your turn was trash 2 assets, you probably need to, for the other turns, maybe draw a card and get economy down. And with Maw, you want to spend 2 clicks on the same asset if you've decided it's a must-trash asset, and that kind of makes it pretty difficult. So I don't actually know if this is going to be like a really strong counter to asset spam decks, as I see it might be seen as being, considering it does punish easy accesses. Otherwise, if you're accessing HQ and R&D regularly every turn, if you're running just good old breakers, economy, and it's the way that like a lot of people deem as like classic Netrunner, get them the accesses while you can, this card's actually really strong, and its effect is really, really hard to play around. There's only certain cards that bring cards back from archives. Of course, you have things like Jackson Howard, preemptive action, and it's a strong effect. It's also very disruptive. It's very, very disruptive, and I can see this getting play. It's also, for what it's worth, is Alice Merchant's console, who is a new runner that's coming out in this cycle. She has an effect. I don't know how I feel about talking about spoilers entirely on this channel yet, but she has an ability that encourages you to run archives to see the cards that you've thrown out, and it's good. She puts a lot of pressure on, and that's okay. There's also some synergy. Oh boy, I don't know how to spell this card, so I'll keep it simple. Apparently that's not right. There's synergy with this card and a card called Hemorrhage, because Hemorrhage wants you to run often, and it lets you trash cards from HQ while not random. This also could, in theory, put a lot of pressure on the corp, and if you have 2 MU, you might have MU to spare on this. But this, again, is really expensive. And you might not just have the tempo and the time to play this 9 credit combo just to get cards out of HQ. But this card is also a lot of fun to play, and I think they work pretty well together. That's Maw. I think Maw is pretty cool. I'm excited to try decks with this, just aggressive decks. The Sneak Door Beta is also really good with this card, considering you have the MU and you want to be accessing centrals, and I think that's pretty sweet. This is the last NR card we have in this pack, and it's called the Archivist. It's a resource and a connection resource, so it can go on the off-campus apartment, you can tutor with hostage, things like that, and it's only 1 credit to play. It's unique, so you can only have 1 Archivist, and the Archivist has a cool ability and some good stats attached to it. Firstly, the Archivist is worth 1 link. It gives you 1 extra link. That's cool. It also has an ability, whenever the corp scores an initiative or security agenda, force the corp to trace 1. If it's unsuccessful, take 1 bad publicity. So this is cool. Firstly, just talking about the link. Link is a thing in the current meta, in the current competitive meta at least. This is up to you to judge based on where you're playing, on what tables you're playing. But for instance, I think it's called this. Global Sec might be 1 word, so I might be goofing this, but Access to Global Sec is a card from the core set, and it is the standard price point for specific link cards. It's not a very exciting card. Pay 1, get 1 link. It's a resource. It's vulnerable to trashing and all that, but that's what this is. And while the Archivist is unique, so you can't put down 3 of it like you could with Access to Global Sec, paying 1 for 1 link is a solid place to start. And if you're playing one of the Anarchs that does start with link, maybe Reina Roja or maybe the more spicy Edward Kim, That's a good thing. You already have 2 Link, which helps a lot dealing with all this trace ice that you might be seeing in some of your NBN matchups. And 2 Link is like a pretty big deal. So I think Link is good, and on its own might be worth considering. There's other problems with this card, but before we go into this, let's talk about the ability, because the ability is really interesting. It says whenever the corp scores an initiative or security agenda, do a trace, maybe you get a bad pub. So it's really important to understand which kind of agendas this is referring to, and this is the list. It's 49 agendas, and we're going to just quickly scroll through these and see how many of these get play in competitive areas, or if you see these agendas a lot, Archivist gets a lot better. This is sorted by faction, so I think out of HB, the one that sees the most play is Efficiency Committee. It's pretty common in Cerebral Imaging, but some fast advanced decks see it. All these other agendas are not that common. Yeah, really not that common. Jinteki does have some solid stuff. Clone Retirement is seeing a bunch of play in fast advanced decks, but I think Nisei Mark II is one of the best agendas in the game, and in more glaciery Jinteki decks, this does see a lot of play. Philotic also sees play, as does House of Knives and Future Perfect. These are all very common agendas. Future Perfect doesn't get scored that often, so it's not good, but House of Knives regularly gets scored, and Philotic also sometimes gets scored, so that's cool. This is page 2. On the NBN side, not that much. Astroscript is a one-of now in most decks, but generally is kind of the best agenda they have. So you can basically say 100% most NBN decks, not 100%, have this card in it, which is good. Net Quarantine is seeing some play nowadays, and Datapool is seeing some limited play. On the Wayland side, all the face-up agendas, so Hollywood Renovation might not be that most popular, but Oaktown Renovation is, and this is a public agenda, an initiative agenda, so that actually does matter. Otherwise, the neutral agendas might be the most common, and that's specifically Global Food Initiative, which is seen in almost all decks at this point in time. Otherwise, you have NAPD, which can see play. It's not that common anymore, but it's a pretty good card. And if they're running NAPD and you get a bad pub, it's harder to score NAPD, which is pretty fun as a counter to decks that rely or run 3 of NAPDs. So that's kind of funny. Global Food is interesting and is in most decks. Now, the problem with Archivist is it only fires when the corp scores an agenda, and not when you steal an agenda. So out of all the agendas we've seen, a lot of the big ones, like these agendas, like the 3-point agendas, this is generally the last agenda the corp scores to win the game. Like not always, but usually this is the last one. So you're not actually going to get an effect when they score this one. And they're also not going to generally score 2 of these. So there's a big chance that your Archivist is only going to fire once. In other matchups, it gets better, but just understand which agendas matter and in which matchups it's better, and maybe you want to make an educated decision based on what you're seeing in your local meta or your local kitchen or whatever it is that you do Netrunner at. I think it's really exciting that we have more cards that actually matter with subtypes. Subtypes have largely, especially on the corp side, been mostly thematic and flavorful, and they actually haven't mattered. I think it's going to be interesting if we do hit some point in time in the game where you actually consider the subtypes on your agendas. Futures Now is a good agenda for what it's worth, but you actually consider the subtypes on your cards when you do building a deck, just so that you build around certain things. I think that could be interesting because a lot of times the global food is everywhere is what I'm trying to say. Now, trace 1 if unsuccessful, take 1 bad publicity. That just means the corp has to spend more money than you are going to. If you don't have any link, you play the Archivist, you have 1 link, so the corp just has to overpay on it. I don't know actually how much the corp will overpay on this trace, and I don't know how much you should be paying for it either. Bad publicity is really, really, really strong. It's very similar to a card like Desperado. The idea is every run you have a credit, and that makes running so much easier. It's also very similar to a card that doesn't see play, but in theory is very good, called Skulljack, which says the trash cost of every card accessed is reduced by 1. That's what bad publicity does. Bad publicity is really, really, really strong, and something you definitely want to get. Like, even if you spend 4 credits getting a bad publicity, I think it might be worth it, just because after you make 4 runs, you've basically paid it off. I could see yourself even paying more on this trace. Now, this trace isn't going to fire very often, so it's not like I don't think it's going to be a reason to run something like Power Tap, because I see this trace firing maybe once a game. So that's not that good. The best thing to play with bad pub is Blackmail, because Blackmail is just a super, super strong card. I'm not convinced, though, that this is a reason to run Blackmail in a deck that isn't Valencia Estevez, just because you need to get this on the table, and it's a connection, so you could in theory tutor for it early game with, again, something like Hostage. But the idea is that you need to get this on the table. The Corp needs to score a specific agenda before you get that card on the table, a specific agenda. And after that point, you have to beat the Trace, and now the 3 cards you put in your deck are good. Let alone if that happens mid to late game, you might not want to run because it turns off the value of your Blackmail, and then you've built yourself a pretty convoluted deck. And that doesn't sound that great. Like, I think this card is pretty strong on its own, even if you don't run Blackmail, just because having a bad pub it's super good and makes everything in this game so much cheaper, and that's worth it. Very important to understand, this card is unique, so it's kind of in a clumsy spot where if it's like super important to your game plan, you might want to run 2. I'm a bit hesitant of running 3 just because you can't install the other ones. Maybe you run Page Piper. But the idea is if this card is unique, how many do you put in your deck? It might just be a cute one of, but if you draw it too late in the game or too late in the game mostly, it's not that great. So I don't know if it's actually going to see that much play. Bad Pub is good though. It's really, really, really good. So for that reason, it might be considered. And just paying 1 credit for 1 link is good in NBN matchups or any like really trace heavy matchups. And I could see that being a compelling reason to run this. These are the criminal cards, of which we have 2. And the first one is Exploit. It's an event. It's 2 credits. And it says play only if you've made a successful run on R&D, HQ, and Archives this turn. For the rest of this, we're going to call this a super run, and it's an idea or a super turn. It's something we've seen on other cards before, but basically if you do a super turn, what happens? You get a D-res up to 3 pieces of ice. Find the weakness, exploit the weakness, repeat. It's also 2 influence, which is not unreasonable to splash. The character in this art, I don't know who that is. I don't think we've seen that person before. I might be mistaken, but we might figure out who that is in the near future. So super turn cards are pretty cool, and now every single runner faction, at least not considering all the mini factions, have a super turn card, and super turn cards have always been very exciting. Just to give you a bit of history, the first one was Notoriety, and Notoriety I think might be the best, if not second best super turn card, because it basically says, make a super turn, you have 1 more agenda point, which is pretty sizable considering that's how you win the game of Netrunner. Other ones, recently we've had Encore, which is pretty cute. Get another turn, that's obviously good. A quest completed is a really strange one, and it's kind of weird how this is an Anarch, all things considered, but it's also really good, and a lot of times this can mean scoring an agenda. And then lastly, we have, by far, I think the best and most fun, Apocalypse, which is Apex's basically signature card, and it says, just throw the table on the floor that you've been playing on because you got to restart the whole thing. And that's awesome and such a good card and just a bunch of fun. But this is Exploit, which just de-reses 3 pieces of ice. Now, de-resing has been a criminal thing. They have all the de-res cards, I think, in the entire game. And de-resing ice is, while it is compelling, I've always found it a bit unfortunate that you compare it to something like Ice Destruction, which is inherently a lot better. Just because not only did you make them waste the money on it, they don't have the ice anymore. And if they had to replace that ice and res a new one, that's kind of like de-resing it, right? Now, with the super turn cards, I've always been a proponent that if you're playing this card just to get the super turn off, it's probably not that good. And you want to be doing something while you're firing the super turn, because if you're just doing this 3 runs that you're going to be spending a lot of money on, and you're not like making Maker's Eye runs or like working or getting Temujin credits or something like this, that this might not be worth the tempo. If we say on average, the ice in a Corp deck is 4 credits. This is a 12 credit swing. It makes the Corp lose 12 credits, which is definitely sizable. But if you want a big swing, like you could play a Count Siphon, that's a 15 credit swing with Aaron Moran. So I'm not that convinced. Compare that also to like Emergency Shutdown, a card which I've classically always called Power Shutdown on accident, but I actually got it right this time. I feel pretty proud about that. This is Emergency Shutdown. It says play only if you made a successful run on HQ, which is something that you're going to have to do anyways to pull off an exploit, and it says de-res a single piece of ice. Now, Corp decks often don't run a lot of high strength ice. They generally run 1 or 2 big pieces of ice and then a bunch of medium to low strength stuff. For that reason, exploit might actually not be that good, because for it to fire, there's a big chance also you'll have 3 res pieces of ice considering you're running every server, which is a problem with this card. It's not that great early game, it's only good mid game once ice is resed. But like if you've already ran HQ, it's not that difficult to just run HQ, play Emergency Shutdown, and then play a same old thing Emergency Shutdown if you have one on the table, which again is your entire turn. You're getting fewer accesses, but you've also shut down 2 cards for probably less credits. And that's like, I think Emergency Shutdown might be better. If corps are running only few big pieces of big ice, it's probably better to target which you derez besides exploiting. I also do think if you want to do exploit, you might be better off playing just Apocalypse if you just want to play a really strong denial game. Yeah, you do have to build your deck around it because your breakers will be trashed and then recursion matters and all that sort of fun stuff. But I think it's just a lot stronger effect than this one. Admittedly, we have seen some of the cards that are coming out in the near future, basically, specifically the blue cards, the criminal cards, and there's been a lot of support. There is a lot of support coming out in terms of IDs and resources and hardware and all that supports derezzing and rezzing ice as a way to reward runners and punish corps. So this might be better in the near future. Otherwise, I'm not convinced it's actually that compelling. It's a pretty big turn to get an effect which is basically like a credit loss. And if you want to make the corp lose credits, you could just play Siphon. You can just play Vamp. I don't know. Derezzing Ice is also... I don't know, it also depends how much ice is being played. I know a lot of like HB decks in my meta are running Next Ice, which is not like that expensive to res. Again, derezzing Next Ice is kind of cool because it decreases the power level of other ice. Maybe you want to derez some Biroids just so Ravana does nothing. Like there's some cute interactions with it 100%, but I'm not convinced it's actually that compelling in most cases, and it's like pretty situational. I don't know, could be a one of in a deck and maybe you get a nice swing somewhere in the mid game once you're getting everything in. Another really cool thing, though, about these power turn cards is I actually think they're best executed within Criminal. Considering Criminal has Sneak Door Beta, so it's super easy to Sneak Door Beta into HQ, then just run Archives, and then run R&D, instead of running a heavily protected HQ, and that's super good. That's cool. This also seems like a good card in Gabe Santiago, who's trying to get into HQ as much as possible, and if you can derez ice on HQ, it's easier to get in there. So that's alright. This is the last criminal card in this pack. It's called Spot the Prey. It's also 2 credits to play. And it's an event. And it says expose 1 non-ice card, then make a run. And it's 2 influence, so it is splashable. This card is really not good. I don't like saying that, and I've actually some of these cards, so far a lot of these cards that we've talked about so far, I think are pretty far below the power curve, but this one this puzzles me. Because this one's like way behind the power curve in some pretty obvious ways and I don't understand it entirely. Let's just talk a bit about what it does. So this card exposes 1 non-ice card, firstly. So 1 non-ice card means a card that's installed either in a remote server or in the root of a central server. So it basically has to be an agenda, an upgrade, or an asset. So that's okay. And you have to make a run. You don't have to make a run on the card you exposed, you can make a run anywhere, but you're paying 2 credits for this ability. It's also not a run event, which we'll talk about a bit later, but that's kind of nuts. But why would you possibly play this? Now, the main reason I think is that advanceable traps is a thing. There's a card called Mushin Notion, which is the bane of me. And the idea is that you Mushin a thing, it has 3 advancement counters on it, and you don't know whether or not to run it. If you don't run it, it could be an agenda that's really obviously good for the corp. It could be, but the thing is, if you do run it, it could be a trap. It could be a Project Junebug, which does 6 net damage to you, which has a high likelihood of being lethal. And so there's a big swing here on this single card. Do I run, do I not run? And for that reason, exposing is pretty good. Now, that's a very targeted situation. Mushin is not seen in that many decks, and there's other ways to deal with it, I think. So what about if you're not playing this in a Mushin deck? If you're playing this against like an acid spam deck, or yeah, let's just say an acid spam deck, or in a deck that's putting things behind ice and you don't know what it is. You're now paying 2 credits to see what a card is, and then you see like, oh, okay, this is a bioethics association, I should trash that. So you haven't saved yourself a click, because you're running it, you just basically spend 2 credits to find out that you have to spend more credits. And there's very few things in these decks, in acid spam decks, that you want to expose and be like, okay, I'm glad I spent 2 credits to find out what that is, considering money is the most important thing in a lot of acid spam decks, and now I'm going to run something else. Let alone it's easy to be in situations where there is nothing else to run that's not like face planted to ice, where you now have to spend money to break it. Let alone you're not doing a power run with something called like a Count Siphon, or a Maker's Eye, or just Inside Job, or anything in particular. And the same idea goes if you put this, like, if you expose a piece of card a card behind ice. Is now you say like, oh, now I know what that is, and maybe you don't have to run it because you see it's an Adonis campaign and not accelerated beta test. But if it is an accelerated beta test, you've now made that server 2 credits more expensive to get into. And if it was an Adonis campaign, you basically could have ran anyways and trashed it for 1 credit because you spent 2 credits on this. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you compare this to options that already exist, it gets even more ludicrous. Like, let's start on the simple end, which is Infiltration, which is a card from the core set that didn't see a lot of play, and it's very simple. It's either gain 2 credits or expose a card. So in the worst case scenario, this is basically a click on the magnum opus. It's a visit, you go to the Armitage code busting, like it's 2 credits. It's not a great card, but it's fine. Or expose a card for 0 credits. Sure, you don't make a run, but that's something. Now compare that to Deuce is Wild, which is the first card designed by Dan D'Argenio, our 2-time World Championship winning Netrunner player, who made this card, which is incredibly comparable to Spot the Prey. It's also 2 credits, and it has a bunch of abilities of which you can choose. Yes, you play 1 influence for this, but one of the abilities is Expose an Ice, which is different, and then Make a Run. Again, anywhere, it doesn't have to be the piece of ice. But on top of that, you can make credits with this card. You can draw 2 cards with this card. You can remove a tag with this card. Like, I think if Expose isn't going to be universally usable in every matchup, you have to kind of pair it with something that's good. And pairing it with Make a Run, when it costs 2 credits to play on its own, isn't particularly good. Now, I think the worst comparison by far, and probably the most apt comparison that makes this card absolutely ridiculous, is Drive-By, which is a card that doesn't see that much play, but I think it should. Drive-By is a double, expose a card installed in a remote server, so that's a bit more limited, but you trash the card at no cost if it is an asset or upgrade, and it's 0. So, in most cases, Spot the Prey is going to be hitting an asset, right? If Drive-By, for 2 clicks, finds out what a card is, and if it is a card that you have to trash, for the second click, runs it and trashes it for free. As opposed to Spot the Prey, which finds out what a card is, you pay a premium for it, and now you have to run it and trash it. Yes, Drive-By is a bit worse if you're exposing an agenda, because now you spend 2 clicks, but you've also saved 2 credits. So maybe it's like playing Spot the Prey and gaining 2 credits. Like, it's nuts. This card is really not good compared to Exposes. I think a card like this could get better if there's more support for Expose. I think there could be like a upcoming hardware or resource or something like that that says when you expose a card, gain credits equal to its res or trash cost, which makes it more interesting to Spot the Prey something and then run something entirely different once you make the money from it, and that could be reasonable. But otherwise, like, this is absurd, and it's so hard to put in a deck because there's so many scenarios in which there's better versions of this. If you're dealing with Mushin Notion, play Drive-By. If you're dealing with Asset Spam, play Drive-By. If you're dealing with upgrades, play Drive-By. If you're dealing with, like, I don't get it. I really don't get it. And perhaps the thing that frustrates me the most about this card is there's a typo on it. It says in the flavor text, so yeah, I just reverse engineered a tracer and then built it back up with some new lines of code. Pretty stellar. What? Like, there's 20 cards in this pack. And it's someone's job, obviously, to edit these cards to make sure not only are they printed with good templating and that the rules are not broken and they're balanced and all that, but also just that they're written in English. In English. Like, proper English. And I'm just so surprised when a product can be released. There was 20 things to read that has a typo on it. Like, that's absurd, and that really upsets me because that's the sort of quality that... Oh man, that's just such a bummer. And beyond the fact that this card is absurdly underpowered, I don't get it. And I'm not saying every card should be powered, but a card should do something unique at least that it inspires like deck building ideas. And I said I'd mentioned this before, but this isn't a run event, which is absurd. Now it doesn't start with the sentence "make a run" that like every other run event I think most of them do. So maybe that's why. But if this was a run event, now it gets actually interesting, where you can play this as a one-of in your deck and then play like Planned Assault. And now if someone motions you, or you're in a situation where like, oh, I really know what that card, need to know what that card is because it really matters for this turn. You can't tutor this card. Like, you actually have to play it in your deck, you have to draw it, and you have to hope you played at a good time, which just seems super unreasonable. So I don't actually see an intelligent way to play that, and I think cards can be underneath the power level. Obviously, most of them are. That's like what a median looks like, but it's not exciting. And it's also super limited, and that kind of, these ideas bleed forward on Biomodeled Network, which is a Shaper virtual resource. Costs 1 to install, which is pretty cheap. It's virtual. And you can trash it at an instant speed whenever there's a paid ability. Or actually, you don't need a paid ability window because it's a prevent effect and it says prevent all but one net damage. It is a virtual resource, which means that Apex can play this. I don't think that's a good reason to do it though, considering Apex is actually pretty good at, is it called Heartbleed? I forget what it's called. Oh, anyways, Apex's console dodges damage, whatever it's called. Heartbleed is probably a thing from the real world. This is Biomodel Network. So you can trash this, prevent all but one net damage, which is only good against massive amounts of net damage. So there's a couple cards in this game that can do a large amount of net damage to you. Obviously, Snare is from the core set, pretty good. Does 3 net damage to you, that can hurt. Project Junebug, I should have wrote more words in there, but Project Junebug, again, can do 6-8 net damage very easily. And if you want to face check things and you don't have your spot to prey, this could be useful. Other cards are things like Ronin, pretty good. Even just Ice that does a lot of net damage. Things like Cortex Lock, that's great. Now, you have to understand, prevent all but one net damage, that's not on a single card or single encounter, that's on like a dealing of net damage. So cards like Komainu, which do a massive amount of small net damage, this card does nothing against it. Because each do 1 net damage is one ability to fire this, and this absolutely does nothing because 1 net damage always breaks through. Now, let alone whether or not I think this card is good, I think it's in a really bad time in the meta, considering the majority of like Jinteki decks, and those are generally the decks that can do net damage, they've kind of shifted away from burst kill options that like do a lot of net damage at once kind of favors, and they've gone more down to these really annoying single net damage fires. So if Potential Unleashed is trying to do like 1 single net damage to you every turn on your turn and their turn, Biomodel Network actually does nothing. So that's a bit upsetting, and I think it's kind of not great right now, at least. But my biggest qualm with this card is Deus Ex. Before I talk about this, it's very important to understand that this cycle is the first or the last full cycle before we hit rotation. And what that means is after this cycle ends, and maybe a deluxe comes out, but basically the cycle after this, let's call it cycle Z, when cycle Z starts, the first data pack of cycle Z, once that comes out, the first 2 cycles of Android Netrunner are no longer tournament legal. So those are Genesis cycle and Spin cycle. So there's a big chance that a lot of the cards in this pack are meant to be replacements for cards we will no longer have in the future. And this seems like the case with Biomodel Network, which seems to be a direct replacement of Deus Ex. I like Deus Ex. Deus Ex is a program, it takes up MU, it's also 3 credits, so it's a bunch more expensive, but it has a bunch of cool abilities on it. First, you can prevent any amount of net damage, and this is a prevent effect, so this happens at any point in time. Now, compare just that to Biomodel Network, which can prevent all but one, which is an interesting, well, albeit I think is an interesting dynamic. This does it technically better. It also gives you the ability to prevent any number of AP subroutines, which makes this card interesting, because now you can choose when to use it. Do I have to break through a piece of ice, or am I worried that at a later point in the game I'm going to have to like access a triple advanced card and I don't know what that is, or I'm worried there's Ronins or anything like that, and that's an interesting decision. It's also a program, which means this card can be tutored with something like self-modifying code, or you can also bring it back with clone chips, or you can test run it, or you can scavenge it. But basically, shapers have a way to pull programs back or onto the table whenever they need them. And for that reason, Deus Ex is really cool, because if you put it in your deck, you can find it as a one-of, you can find it when you need it. And that's cool, because that's kind of shapers, what shapers do. Biomodeled is a resource, and there's only currently 1 card that shapers can use to tutor resources, and that's, sorry, let me organize this a bit better. And that's Artist Colony. And to do that, you have to sacrifice an agenda, which is a pretty stiff penalty, but that's the only way to get up your biomodeled in a pinch. Which means if you're playing biomodeled and you need to find it, you need to run more than one of it, otherwise you have to get lucky that you find it, and let alone, that's just not exciting. This card is so, and this is my problem with this sort of design, and I don't like it, is this card is so specific. It does one thing relatively well, but it does nothing else. So we're starting to build a deck, we're pushing ourselves more towards a game where the matchup is largely decided not by intelligent decisions within the game, but more about deck building. Like if I'm going to Store Championship in Chicago, a place I've never played Netrunner, I could ask people, hey, is there a lot of net damage? And if they say there is a lot of net damage, I might want to put Biomodel Network in my deck. And if I don't, maybe I just lose because I can't deal with all the net damage. Like I'd lose before the game starts because I'm not prepared for it. Yeah, you can win a game even if you don't have the tech for it, but this card does nothing else. That it's just basically if you put in your deck, it is a meta decision. I'm not a big fan of that because this card does nothing else. Compare that to Deus Ex, which if you want to put in not and take up one of your precious 45 plus card slots, this does help against net damage, but it also has another interesting ability. It helps you deal with AP subroutines on a piece of ice. So it's actually useful against so many cards. I think there's around 50 AP ice in the game. Let's just see what that is. There's like probably 50, and they're amongst all factions. Actually, NBN even has one. Look at that. But like, it's just super good in every single matchup, and it doesn't feel like a dead card. I've said this argument many times before, and it's kind of the same argument between Plastic Carapace and Sports Hopper. I think Sports Hopper is a well-designed card that is interesting. You have to figure out when to pump it. There's a lot of choices involved in it. And while there is one single choice on Biomodel Network, which is when do I play it, and you could just boil that down to only use it when you, not play it, when you use it. And you could boil that down to only use it when you're going to die. I just don't like this. It's dead in so many matchups, even in so many Jiteki matchups. It just seems like such a bummer as compared to Deus Ex, which is an interesting card that requires intelligent thought and management of resources. May those resources be clone chips, self-modifying code, breaking ice. And this is just not great. Not excited. I really am worried. I want to see more interesting cards that are going to rotate things out. Like if we need a nice Shaper answer to the Deus Ex problem, I'm hoping this isn't it. Let's move on. This is Network Exchange. It's another virtual resource. I actually really like the idea that Shapers have all the virtual resources. It seems pretty on brand. It's 2 to install, and it says the install cost of each piece of ice that is not installed in the innermost position is increased by 1. So this is an economy denial card in Shaper, which I'm pretty confident is unheard of. That's totally new for this game. So just to understand how this works, this is also probably worth knowing because I know a lot of people goof this when they're newer to Netrunner, is the install cost of the first piece of ice costs you nothing. There's no additional cost. But if you want to install a second piece of ice in front of that ice, it costs 1 credit. And then the third piece of ice costs 2 extra credits, and then 3 credits, and so far on linearly ad infinitum. This goofs with that math a bunch. It makes it so the first piece of ice is still free, but the second piece of ice no longer costs 1 to install. It's additional, it costs 2. And then 3 and 4 and 5 as you keep strapping ice onto that server. And that's definitely economy denial. I think it's kind of weird to start printing economy denial cards in Shaper, considering our friend Beth Kilrain Chang has just come out. And this is a card that actually encourages you to play a more control Shaper deck that has the runner, allows the corp to have a lot of money, just so that this card gets really good. And this card I've seen in, I think I haven't seen it. Oh, how do you phrase this? There's no Shaper deck that I've seen that does not play this card. At least one of, considering just how good it is for how little money it is. It's just universally great. Also, people have started to play Peace in Our Time just because it works well with Beth Kilrain Chang, and having money to set up is kind of the most important thing with Shaper, because generally the Shaper strategy is have all your stuff set up, be able to break any server, be able to like stop fast advance, and at that point you're in control, and that's why this is a control deck. So playing a card that denies the money kind of hurts your Beth Kilrain Chang. It kind of counteracts Peace in Our Time, and for that reason it's kind of interesting. Econ denial is only good if you're running very aggressively, which is not something Shaper does entirely, but I'd be excited to see that, because that's one of the big reasons why I don't play a lot of Shapers, because I'm more of an aggressive runner than I am a sit back and control runner. I don't like sitting back and clicking Magnum Opus. Let's compare this card to Xanadu. Xanadu has been the standard when it comes to econ denial resources. It's virtual as well, which is cute. It's a unique, which is an interesting point considering Network Exchange isn't. And it says the res cost of all ice is increased by 1. So every single ice, if you're going to res it, costs you 1 extra, and that's sizable. Like say throughout a game, you want to maybe pay attention to this in the future, but you find out a corp has resed 8 ice. Let's just say 6 ice after you put Xanadu on the table. So Xanadu has done how much work? Like 3 credits worth of work. It also changes how the corp plays, which is hard to measure. It maybe throw out some of the more expensive ice, so it's hard to calculate all those things, but it does something off the gate. And I think Xanadu is really good in Anarch, specifically because it makes it more expensive to res ice. And what Anarch likes to do is trash ice, With things like Parasite, things like Cutlery, Cipher, it's actually pretty easy, arguably too easy right now, to trash ice. And so if you're going to have to get your ice trashed, you're going to have to keep rezzing your ice and putting more ice down. And then the Xanadu tax does add up pretty quickly, as opposed to if there's no ice destruction and you have 3 ice on R&D and you think that's good, I don't need any more. Now, the thing about Network Exchange, it actually doesn't work well with ice destruction, which is something Shaper has been doing relatively well right now with Cipher and Parasite. Because you actually want the corp to strap multiple pieces of ice on every server for this tax actually to be relevant. Paying 3 credits to put the second piece of ice on a server that actually is a lot of money. Now, about the virtual thing about this card is, or not the virtual thing, about the non-unique thing is that you can play 3 of these cards. They're not unique, right? So if you spend 3 clicks and 6 credits to get 3 of these down, the second piece of ice now on every server costs 4. And that's substantial. I don't think a lot of corps are going to be able to double ice a lot of servers that quickly in the game. And if you're putting like very constant pressure on a corp, it's going to definitely be a problem. Now, because this is a virtual resource and not a hardware or anything like that, there is no easy way to get 3 of them on the table that quickly. Like there is no bazaar, there is no replicator, there's nothing like that. So if you're going to want them, you're going to have to draw into them. And that is a bit unfortunate because this card is super good very, I don't know, maybe very early. I don't know. It's just econ denial, which is weird. Economic denial gets best in decks that actually control the corpse economy. So if you want to play something like Vamp, if you want to play something like Account Siphon, that's really good. Just because the corp doesn't have money, they can't afford to install second pieces of ice, and they'll probably have to throw them away. And then the HQ gets more flooded, and just a lot of good things happen. I think if somebody can pull that off, it's probably Jasminder Serene. Jasmindir, that's not right. Jasminder Serene, just because she's the best with econ denial, with things like Siphon and Vamp. So that's pretty cool, and maybe that's a reason to run Jasminder. I'm interested to see what the economy denial aggressive Shaper looks like. You can also splash this. It's 2 influence, which is a bit sizable, and if you want all 3 of them, that's 6 influence. And again, no faction can tutor virtual resources, I don't think. But it could be cool in a criminal deck. It could be really cool with things like a Fisk Investment Seminar. Just because if you make them draw a lot of ice, they might not be able to afford to install them, and they might throw them out. And I think it's kind of neat. Kind of neat. Again, do you play this in Apex? I don't know, considering Apex has a hard time taxing out credits. Alright, last card in this pack. This is Mad Dash, and I think this is the kind of the shining star in this pack of relatively not great runner cards. This is Mad Dash. It's a neutral run event, no influence, cost 0, so already pretty good stuff. And it says, make a run. When this run ends, add Mad Dash to your score area as an agenda worth 1 agenda point if you stole at least 1 agenda during the run. Otherwise, suffer 1 meat damage. This card seems to be really good. How good, I can't actually say, but the thing is, anytime you have a card that says it's worth an agenda point, you definitely have to consider it, because that's how 90% of runners win. This makes 90% of the runners win faster or more reliably, and for that reason, we have to definitely consider this. So if you play this, it's free, that's really good, and if you hit an agenda on that run, you're closer to winning. If you don't, you take a meat damage, and taking a meat damage, like even playing this as the Mad Dash and not understanding and just like blindly doing it, is probably not amazing, but taking 1 meat damage actually isn't that much of a punishment. Like if this card costs 2 credits, people would be a bit more hesitant to play it like blindly, but like meat damage isn't that big of a problem unless you're running like singleton programs and no recursion, so basically if you're running criminal decks. Okay, so this card is very comparable to a card that does see play, which is called Freedom Through Equality. Freedom Through Equality is a bunch more expensive. It's a current, which is good because it turns off corp currents, but it says anytime you make a run while this is online, you get an extra agenda point when you score an agenda, and then Freedom Equality gets pulled off because it gets added to the score area. The same thing also has to be understood with Mad Dash, is that it's added to your score area, so you can't Mad Dash, ooh, more agendas, same old thing Mad Dash, like your Mad Dash is basically out of the game. And this card definitely did see play, and the big reason is why these cards are so good. You have to understand a bit about deck building and the way a lot of people have been building decks recently. I'm gonna open this. I'm not very familiar with this deck list, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, there you go. So this is a reason why Mad Dash is pretty good. So this was a trend that was started in a lot of HB decks when people were playing Glaciary HB decks, and the idea is the agenda suite running only 2 pointers in a Global Food Initiative. Because if you look at this deck, it's running 2-point agendas. They're all 2-pointers, except 2 of them are global food initiatives, while being 3-pointers are only considered to be 2-pointers in the runner's score area. So no matter what, no matter which agenda the runner accesses, they have to access 4 out of the 10 agendas in the entire deck, which is actually a pretty tall order. However, on the corp side, they only have to score 3 if they score 2 2-pointers and a global food. So the corp is already at an advantage. But scoring 4 out of 10 agendas is pretty hard. It's actually pretty difficult, and that's why Mad Dash or Freedom Through Equality is so good. Because as soon as you Mad Dash or Freedom and you access any single one of these agendas, it becomes worth 3 points. And now, no matter what other agendas you access, you only need 2 more. So if a Mad Dash fires once, you only need 3 agendas to win, and that's obviously huge, because having to access 3 out of 10 agendas throughout an entire game, besides accessing 4 out of 10 agendas throughout the entire game, is a much bigger difference. And for that reason, it does see a lot of, it should see a lot of play. An interesting thing about this card, though, is if you continue to extrapolate on that math, you realize that running multiple of these in your deck might not be that sweet. If you run one of them and one of them fires, you got a 3-pointer, and you still have to steal 2 agendas. If you fire 2 of them off in a game, this agenda's worth 6 points, or 3 points, this agenda's worth 3 points, and you're still at 6 points, and you still need to score 1 more agenda. So firing 2 off in a game actually does not help you. Firing 3 off in a game also doesn't help you, because you still need to access 3 agendas. Like, it's really strange. I'd see why you'd want to run more than one of these in your deck, just so you find it when you want it, but basically playing 3 of these in a game is unlikely to actually help you win, besides if you're running against a corp with more 1-pointers, things like breaking news, maybe stuff like that. But otherwise, in most Glaciary decks, running much of these is not that good. And also, Mad Dash does work with Freedom, because this is a current, this is a run event. So you can, again, have a Freedom Through Equality played, and then play Mad Dash, and again, you'll score an agenda and be worth 4 points. But again, if you don't play another Mad Dash or another Freedom, you'll still need 2 more agenda points to win. So I don't know how good that is either. Besides that, if you play 1 Mad Dash, which again is a run event, so you can tutor it when you know it's going to fire, you need it with things like Planned Assault and Criminal, that's really good, because it makes you so much closer to winning the game, because you no longer need 4 agenda points. Now, Mad Dash only works if you access agenda during that run, so you want to be a bit careful about it. And how do you do that? I think there's actually a lot of pretty compelling ways to make sure your Mad Dash fires. Let's start in Criminal. You do have spy cameras, which is a really cool card, especially in Geist, and it lets you see the top card of R&D. You do have to be careful that the corp can't shuffle their R&D, but if you see an agenda on top of R&D and the corp can't shuffle it, and you can get into R&D, even if you inside job it if you have to, that's easily 3 agenda points with Mad Dash, and that's pretty cool. Shaper has things like indexing. Indexing C5 cards, rearrange the order, so you're likely to come back and get an agenda when you need it. That's pretty dope. What else am I missing out? You Find the Truth. Really cool card. Also, it's just really good in Atom. I could see some people splashing it too, but you're going to see the top of R&D. Mad Dash in. Mad Dash is also a run event, so it works good with Always Be Running. I'm probably forgetting something here. There's that Sunny one, something Global Sec, which this could be a cool Sunny card. That's a Global Sec security clearance. Sees the top card of R&D. There's actually a lot of compelling options. Even just having a turning wheel with a whole bunch of counters, and then running HQ with a Mad Dash and using all your turning wheel counters to see most of HQ, that's actually pretty good too. Even having 3 R&D interfaces and running R&D, there's a big chance that this thing will fire and you'll get another agenda point. And I think this card's actually really easy to play. Mad Dash, that is. R&D interface also, it's not that hard to play. It's a bit expensive, but that's not the point. Totally cool card. Oh yeah, one thing really cute. Somebody commented this on Reddit thread, and I really like this a lot. If, say, early game, you're playing Film Critic, and you access an agenda, and you host it on Film Critic, which, again, you have to spell right. But if you spell that correctly, which I gave shit about that earlier. If you spell that correctly, really? Oh, Film Critic, Jesus. You can, if you Mad Dash and you post an agenda on Film Critic, it's not going to count because you didn't score the agenda. Film Critic hosted it. But then later in the game, when you're ready to close off the game, if you have an Aesop's pawn shop installed and you pawn your Film Critic, all the cards that are hosted on Film Critic get thrown into the archives, and then you can Mad Dash in the archives and get your last 3 points. If you do that, you are a really cool Netrunner player. And that's actually a funny way to close the game at only 3 agendas. I think Mad Dash is really, really solid. This is definitely going to see play. It's easy to play in just about any faction. There's like other cards like this. What is it? Power to the People that got played, and this is like a very similar condition too. I think this one's a priority, so it's very limited. It gives you 7 credits, which is good. But there's not that many like exposed effects. Like see the top card of R&D effects in Anarch. I don't know. Also, Mad Dash technically works with Keyhole, right? Like you Keyhole 3 times, and then you have agendas and archives, and you Mad Dash in, and that's good too in Anarch. That is all the runner cards in this pack. There are more corp cards than runners. I think it's 8 to 12 the split. But overall, this pack has had a lot of like, I don't want to say stinkers, but a lot of cards that are either not that ambitious in terms of design or not that interesting in terms of their effects. I think it's important to understand the last cycle, the last data packs had some really, 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 really good cards in it. And some people have argued 2 good cards, and hopefully we'll actually see some additions to the most wanted list or changes and stuff like that. I don't think it's good to only release like really strong cards just because that encourages power creep. And now it gets a bit, it sucks when the business model is wanting to sell cards and they just keep selling better cards. Like that's bad for the game and short-sighted. But that being said, there's a lot of cards in this pack that don't make sense, and maybe they just don't make sense now, but regardless. Stay tuned for the corp side. There's 12 cards in there, and there's a lot of actually pretty interesting stuff, and they'll be coming out tomorrow evening. If you do have any comments, and maybe something I've missed, any cute interactions you want with these cards, or the kind of decks you want to build around, let me know in the comments below. Those are always read and replied to. But most of all, yeah, videos every weekday night, and this Thursday specifically, which if you're watching this in the future, that's bad radio. There's a live stream, 8:45 every Thursday, and this week's particularly is going to be interesting. We're doing a draft in person in the Randolph Boutique, so I'm excited for that. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know your opinion on these cards, and stay tuned tomorrow night for the corp side of Daedalus Complex. That's what it's called, right? Yeah, it is. Thanks for watching. Ciao.